For 31 days, a little girl was missing, and the person closest to her never called police. Tonight, we examine the verdict America still argues about.
The first call to 911 was placed at 8:44 p.m. on July 15, 2008. The caller was Cindy Anthony, a frantic grandmother in Orlando, Florida, demanding that police arrest her own daughter for stealing a car and money. But the dispatcher needed more information to justify an emergency response. During that call, Cindy revealed she had just recovered the missing white Pontiac Sunfire from a tow yard. Then, she gave the dispatcher the detail that changed everything. She told the dispatcher that the car smelled like a dead body had been inside it.
Wait, she actually used those exact words? A mother told police her own daughter's car smelled like a corpse?
She did, and she followed it up with a second call. This time, the panic was absolute. Cindy told the dispatcher that she had found her daughter, 22-year-old Casey Anthony, but that Casey's 2-year-old child was missing.
How long had the child been missing?
According to what Casey told her mother that night, little Kaylee had been gone for 31 days.
31 days? A 2-year-old is missing for a month, and the mother never calls the police? That is not just suspicious, that changes the entire emotional temperature of the case.
It fundamentally altered how law enforcement viewed the mother from the first minute they met her. When Orange County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the Anthony home that night, they walked into a mystery that would soon consume the entire country. But in those initial hours, there was no media circus. There was only a terrified grandmother, an evasive young mother, and a missing toddler.
If they lived together, how did a month go by without the grandmother realizing the child was actually gone?
To understand how the Anthony family reached that breaking point on July 15th, we have to look at the environment Kaylee Anthony was born into. The Anthony home on Hope Spring Drive in Orlando, Florida, looked entirely normal from the outside. George Anthony was a former law enforcement officer who had previously worked in homicide. Cindy Anthony was a registered nurse. They were hardworking, middle-class parents who provided a comfortable life for their children. In August 2005, their daughter Casey gave birth to a little girl named Kaylee. Casey was 19 years old and unmarried. She refused to name the father, and to this day his identity has never been confirmed.
Did the grandparents step in to raise her, or was Casey taking on the role of a full-time mother?
It was a complex blend of both. Cindy and George adored Kaylee. By all accounts, Kaylee was a bright, talkative, and happy child who loved books and music. Video footage from those years shows a smiling toddler surrounded by toys and affection. Friends noted that Casey appeared to be a loving, attentive mother. She lived with her parents, and they provided the financial and logistical support required to raise the child. Casey claimed she had a job as an event planner at Universal Studios, which supposedly allowed her to support herself and her daughter.
But if she was living at home and working, there must have been a daily routine. When did that routine start to fracture?
The tension was building beneath the surface for months. Cindy and George were increasingly frustrated with Casey. They suspected she was stealing money from them and lying about her responsibilities. But they tolerated the friction because their primary concern was keeping Kaylee close and safe. That delicate balance collapsed entirely on June 16, 2008. On that day, a massive argument allegedly took place at the Anthony home. After the dispute, Casey left the house with 2-year-old Kaylee. It was the last day anyone other than Casey Anthony would ever see the child alive.
So she leaves the house on June 16th. What exactly happened over the next month?
The period between June 16th and July 15th is the defining vacuum of the case. For 31 days, Cindy and George tried to see their granddaughter. Every time they asked, Casey offered a detailed, plausible excuse. Kaylee was at the beach with a nanny. Kaylee was sleeping. Casey was working a double shift at Universal Studios and left the child with a caregiver. Casey was so convincing that her parents believed her, until the lies became impossible to sustain.
Wait, hold on. Where was Casey actually spending her time during those 31 days if she was not at home with her parents?
She was staying with her boyfriend, Tony Lazzaro, and spending time with various friends. During those weeks, Casey went shopping, frequented nightclubs, and even entered a hot body contest at a local bar. She got a tattoo on her shoulder that read Bella Vita, which is Italian for beautiful life. To everyone around her, she behaved like a carefree, single, 22-year-old woman. She never once acted like a mother frantically searching for a kidnapped child. She also abandoned her white Pontiac Sunfire in the parking lot of a local check-cashing business, which is why it ended up in a tow yard.
But what about her boyfriend? Did he not ask where her 2-year-old daughter was?
He did ask. Casey told him that Kaylee was with the nanny, a woman she named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, whom she referred to as Zanny. She even used her cell phone to stage fake conversations, talking out loud to this supposed nanny in front of her friends to create the illusion that everything was fine. When the police finally questioned her on July 16th, after Cindy made that 911 call, Casey gave them the exact same story. She claimed this nanny had kidnapped Kaylee in early June, and she had been trying to find her on her own because she was terrified.
Did law enforcement believe the kidnapping story at all, or did they immediately suspect she was lying?
They were highly skeptical, but they had to follow the leads. And this is where we need to slow down, because the way Casey's lies unraveled reveals exactly how she handled pressure. Detectives asked Casey to take them to her job at Universal Studios so they could verify her employment and search her workspace for clues. Casey agreed. She drove to the theme park with the detectives. She walked them through the security gates. She led them down a long administration hallway.
Wait, she knew she did not work there. She knew the hallway would eventually end, right? So why keep walking with detectives right next to her?
That is the psychological mystery of Casey Anthony. She walked confidently past multiple offices, pretending she belonged there. She took them all the way to the end of a corridor, turned around, and finally admitted she did not work there. She had not worked there for years. The job was entirely fabricated.
That is astonishing. She dragged the lie to the absolute physical edge of reality before admitting it. Did the nanny exist either?
No. Detectives tracked down a woman named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, who had once visited an apartment complex Casey was familiar with, but the woman had never met Casey and had never babysat a child in her life. The nanny was a phantom, the job was a phantom, and the police quickly realized that the kidnapping was a phantom too. On July 16th, Casey Anthony was arrested for child neglect, making false official statements and obstructing a criminal investigation. But the missing child was still nowhere to be found.
How long did it take for the investigation to transition from a missing child case to a murder trial?
The search for Kaylee gripped the nation for 5 months, but the tragic resolution came on December 11, 2008. A meter reader named Roy Kronk walked into a wooded, swampy area just a quarter-mile from the Anthony family home. There, submerged in water and hidden by dense brush, he found a plastic bag containing human skeletal remains. The remains were positively identified as 2-year-old Kaylee Anthony.
After 5 months in a Florida swamp, what could a medical examiner actually determine about how she died?
Very little, and that forensic limitation would become the central battleground of the entire case. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide by undetermined means. There was no trauma to the bones. There was no soft tissue left to test for strangulation or drowning. However, investigators found a piece of duct tape attached to the hair mass and skull, which they interpreted as the murder weapon. Prosecutors theorized that Casey had incapacitated her daughter, placed duct tape over her mouth and nose to suffocate her, and discarded the body in the woods so she could live a life free of parental responsibility.
If the cause of death is officially undetermined, how do prosecutors bridge the gap between lying to the police and a premeditated murder charge? What physical evidence connected Casey directly to the death?
Prosecutors built their case on circumstantial and highly contested forensic science. The primary focus was the white Pontiac Sunfire. When police first inspected the car, they noted a distinct, overwhelming odor. An expert in decomposition odor analysis testified that the air in the trunk contained chemical compounds consistent with human decomposition. Cadaver dogs had also alerted to the trunk. Prosecutors also introduced a single hair found in the trunk. An expert testified that the hair showed signs of root banding, a microscopic darkening at the root that can indicate hair falling from a decomposing body.
Was that forensic method widely accepted at the time, or was it being tested in court?
The defense aggressively challenged its reliability. They argued that the odor analysis was experimental and not an exact science. They pointed out that garbage had been left in the trunk, which could account for the smell. Regarding the hair, defense experts argued that root banding was not exclusive to decomposition and did not definitively prove a dead body had been in the trunk. The defense team, led by attorney Jose Baez, systematically attacked every piece of forensic evidence.
What about the duct tape? That seems like a very specific item to find with skeletal remains.
The state argued the duct tape was undeniable evidence of intent to kill. They even alleged that an FBI analyst found residue of a heart-shaped sticker on the tape, suggesting Casey used it to cover the child's mouth. But the defense challenged the tape evidence just as fiercely. They noted that the tape was not attached to the bone, but merely tangled in the hair and roots after months in the elements. They argued it could have been picked up from the surrounding trash in the woods. Furthermore, the defense pointed out that the heart-shaped sticker residue was never photographed or preserved before it allegedly dissolved during testing.
What about digital evidence? I remember hearing about computer searches that seemed incredibly incriminating.
Prosecutors introduced evidence showing that someone using the Anthony family computer had searched for the word chloroform 84 times before Kaylee disappeared. They argued this proved premeditation. They theorized Casey used chloroform to sedate the child before applying the duct tape. But this, too, became deeply disputed. The defense argued that the search was a typo by Cindy Anthony, who was looking up information on chlorophyll. Later, a software designer admitted the forensic tool used to extract the browser history had a glitch. The actual number of searches for chloroform was exactly 1, not 84.
Only one search? That completely changes the narrative of someone obsessively researching how to sedate a child.
Exactly, and the defense used every one of these forensic gaps to create reasonable doubt. But Jose Baez did not just attack the prosecution's science. In his opening statement, he dropped a bombshell that shocked the courtroom and the country. He claimed that Kaylee had not been murdered at all. According to the defense, on June 16th, Kaylee accidentally drowned in the Anthony family swimming pool.
A drowning? If it was an accident, why on earth would a mother hide the body in a swamp and lie about a kidnapping?
Baez offered a dark and controversial explanation. He alleged that George Anthony discovered the drowned child and, instead of calling 911, told Casey she would go to prison for child neglect for the rest of her life. The defense claimed George took the body and orchestrated the cover-up. Furthermore, Baez alleged that Casey had been suffering from a lifetime of abuse at the hands of her father, which conditioned her to comply with his demands and retreat into a fantasy world of lies as a coping mechanism.
Did they provide any physical proof of that abuse? Or proof that George covered up a drowning?
No. There was no physical evidence presented to substantiate the claims of abuse, and George Anthony vehemently denied both the abuse and any involvement in a cover-up. But the defense strategy was a calculated risk. They did not have to prove that George covered up a drowning. They only had to create enough reasonable doubt that the jury could not be absolutely certain Casey committed premeditated murder.
So the jury is presented with two unprovable theories. The state says it was premeditated suffocation with duct tape, but they cannot prove the medical cause of death. The defense says it was an accidental drowning and a grandfather's cover-up, but they have no proof either. What exactly is a jury supposed to do with that?
They had to rely on the strict burden of proof. The prosecution had the burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Casey Anthony intentionally killed her daughter. They had a mountain of evidence proving Casey was a chronic liar. They proved she abandoned her family, partied while her child was missing, and misled police. But in the eyes of the law, being a liar and a negligent mother does not automatically equate to being a first-degree murderer.
It feels like the entire trial hinged on whether the jury could separate her repulsive behavior after the fact from the actual moment of death, which no one witnessed.
That is exactly what happened. The judge instructed the jury on the parameters of reasonable doubt. On July 5, 2011, after a trial that dominated national television for 6 weeks, the jury returned their verdict. They found Casey Anthony not guilty of first-degree murder. They found her not guilty of aggravated child abuse. They found her not guilty of aggravated manslaughter of a child. She was only convicted on 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to a law enforcement officer.
Because the justice system demands proof of the crime itself, not just proof that the defendant is a dishonest person. Even if the entire world believes she is guilty.
Exactly. The verdict sent shockwaves across the country. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered in anger. Media commentators expressed outrage. For millions of people who had watched the trial, the lack of a murder conviction felt like a massive miscarriage of justice. But legal experts pointed to the forensic limitations. Without a clear cause of death, without an eyewitness, and with highly contested scientific evidence, the jury felt they could not legally cross the threshold of beyond a reasonable doubt.
What happened to Casey after the verdict?
Casey Anthony was sentenced to 4 years for the misdemeanor charges, but with time served and good behavior, she was released just days after the verdict. She walked out of the Orange County Jail in the middle of the night, stepping into a life of infamy. Today, the case remains officially closed, but practically unresolved. The truth of what happened on June 16, 2008, remains buried in the swamp where Kaylee was found, and trapped behind the silence of a mother who walked free. A 2-year-old girl lost her life, and the legal system could only prove that her mother lied about it. If this case left you questioning the evidence, subscribe for more careful investigations into cases that still divide people.
And tell us in the comments what you believe happened, because the timeline still leaves room for difficult questions.
If this episode was worth your time, a like helps support the channel and keeps these stories in front of people who still want answers.
Stay safe, and keep questioning everything.